Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth Series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, December 19th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined virtually in our virtual studio by Jared Duval, who's the executive director of the Energy Action Network. Jared has served as the executive director there since 2017, and before heading up the Energy Action Network, Jared served as the Economic Development Director at the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development. In addition to his work at EAN, Jared also serves as the appointed member of the Vermont Climate Council, where he chairs the Science and Data Subcommittee. Jared, great to have you back.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's really great to be with you again.
It's always a pleasure to have you on. It's always an interesting conversation, and also good to see you again just a few weeks after your post-election conference up at Montpelier. Very interesting conference and day of hearing from some of the important leaders, both at the federal and state levels up there, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. In addition to the annual progress report that your Energy Action Network puts out, which is always great reading. I'll just say this, I'll take a moment here to just say to all the folks who are watching, if you haven't had a chance to read this yet, they produce this out every year, and a great storehouse of information and good stuff to know about. Well, Jared, which makes me wonder, maybe just to get us started here, can you tell us a little bit about the Energy Action Network and what does it do?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So Energy Action Network is really two things. It's a network of nonprofit organizations, businesses, any organization or entity in the state of Vermont, colleges and universities, utilities, anybody who wants to be part of working together to meet Vermont's energy and climate commitments. It is a network for them to come together, share information, learn, collaborate. And then in support of that network, Energy Action Network is also a small nonprofit organization. We have a team of 3, and we serve as a convener and facilitator of our network of members. But what we're probably most known for is the role that we play doing independent data tracking, research, and analysis in terms of where does Vermont stand relative to our climate commitments and energy goals, and what will it take to meet those. So every year we produce what you had just held up, the annual progress report for Vermont on emissions, energy, equity, and the economy. And we draw from federal, state, local data sources to tell as accessible and helpful of a story as we can about what we know about where we stand and what the opportunities are to reduce pollution and reduce energy costs for Vermonters. So anybody who is interested in that, it is available on our website at eanvt.org. And we produce graphs and infographics, and all of those are available free and open source. You'll often see them in the media or in newsletters from town energy committees or other organizations. We're really just trying to make sure that Vermont's energy conversation is grounded in the latest and highest quality available data and information, and that we're having an evidence fact-based conversation about where we stand and what it will take to meet what the state has committed to.
So what are then some of the key findings in this most recent 2024 report, do you think? Are we kind of on track to where we want to be getting in terms of the climate goals the state has set, or not so much?
Well, before we get to where we stand with Vermont's statewide climate pollution, our number one finding is that climate disruption is clearly here. And it's especially here in Vermont, and we're feeling the impacts here. So if you look across the country in terms of climate-related federal disaster declarations, since 2011, Vermont has had the 7th most of those climate-related federal disaster declarations of any state in the country. Our per capita disaster costs are the 5th highest in the country. And some parts of our state, it's amazing. I'm talking to you in Montpelier. I live in Washington County. Washington County tied for the second highest number of federally declared disasters of any county in the entire United States. So we know that climate disruption is here. We know that it is creating very significant costs for Vermonters in their homes, their businesses, and places of worship, etc. So this is not theoretical. We know that the climate crisis is real. It's having very severe impacts. And as much as we very much need to focus on how do we become more resilient and how do we adapt in the face of that, we also know that there can be no true or durable resilience or adaptation if we're not also getting at the root cause of the problem, which is the pollution that comes from burning fossil fuels that's led to this crisis in the first place. So as we work towards greater resilience and adaptation in the face of climate disruption, we also need to be doing our part to stop digging in the hole we're in and move towards a less polluting energy future.
Well, one of the steps that the state was trying to take to move in that direction was legislation that was passed, 4 years ago in 2020, the Global Warming Solutions Act. And I was just wondering, in your capacity as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, I guess I just wondered if you have any feelings about, kind of where that legislation is going, or I should say, maybe more precisely, the Clean Heat Standard legislation that was passed last year grew out of the Global Warming Solutions Act. That's where the legislature wanted some more investigatory work to be done to and have, I think, as the Public Utility Council come back with a recommendation. But that's been a very controversial bit of business, right? Because some people are concerned that the affordability aspect of that is not quite as great as we'd like it to be. So, but I just wondered, you've got your ear close to the ground up there in Montpelier. What is your sense of where, as a new legislature returns in January, what are our next steps on that one?
Yeah, so let's start with the Global Warming Solutions Act and what it is and why it's important. I should say that I'm really familiar with the Global Warming Solutions Act because it is the act that created the Vermont Climate Council and charged the Climate Council with crafting Vermont's climate action plan, among other things, to do our part to reduce the climate pollution that we create here. And so, as an appointed member of the council, I'm very much focused on what does this law, the law of Vermont, the Global Warming Solutions Act, say, and where does it come from? And I think it's worth pausing on that because what it says, really no more, no less, is that as a state, we should take responsibility for reducing the pollution that we create in line with science-based targets designed to help do our part towards avoiding the worst effects of climate disruption. So the targets that are in that law are consistent with what the United States is committed to as part of an international commitment around the Paris Climate Agreement, designed to do our part to limit temperature increases and climate disruption, beyond tipping point, really disastrous levels. So this isn't about Vermont solving the climate crisis. It's not about Vermont reducing emissions elsewhere. It's about looking in the mirror and saying, we have a part to play as well. And it's especially important that we do that in Vermont because when we look around the region, when we look globally, our pollution is really outsized compared to other places when we look on a per person basis. So Vermont has the second highest climate pollution per person of any state in New England. We have made the least progress towards the 2025 target that is in our Global Warming Solutions Act and that is also the target the United States committed to as part of the Paris Climate Agreement, have made the least progress towards that target of any state in New England. Our emissions are more than twice the global average. And so there is a moral responsibility there in terms of doing our part to reduce pollution, to avoid the worst impacts of climate disruption for our generation and also our kids, and in terms of the state and the world that we leave them. But the other thing that is really important here is that fossil fuels are not our friends, not just when it comes to climate pollution, but when it comes to energy costs and the Vermont economy. Fossil fuels are incredibly expensive, incredibly price volatile, and when we spend money on them, about 75 cents of every dollar that we do leaves Vermont. We import 100% of the fossil fuel into Vermont. So when we spend money on it, it is not helping our local economy the way that spending money on weatherization or electricity or energy sources that are keeping our dollars more local would. So that's a really big portion of this. And I think a lot of what I and others focus on the Climate Council is how do we achieve those win-win solutions where we are able to cut costs as we are cutting pollution. And I'd love to get into some of the examples about how we do that, because I think right now a lot of the public conversation is backwards or upside down. And when we really look at the numbers, what is unaffordable is continued exposure to and dependence on fossil fuels. It is not the more efficient and less expensive energy options related to energy efficiency and clean energy.
Well, let's do that then. But before we do, I just think it's an interesting point you make there about how, even though Vermont's a small state, and probably a lot of, I've certainly heard many people say, well, we can break our backs trying to reduce our carbon emissions, but it's going to make almost no difference in the grand global scheme of things, because there's only 646,000 of us, and what happens here in 1 year is would not even make a dent of some of the pollution or carbon emissions that come out of other parts of the world. So I think that's an important point to make. But what are some of the things that you think we should be doubling down on?
Well, before I get to that, let me just back up and pick up where you started, Andrew, which is I think the problem with that logic that we're a small state, so we shouldn't work to reduce pollution, is that in reality, every single state, every single country can say we alone cannot fix the climate crisis. The only way we're going to be able to reduce pollution enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate destabilization is if we all take responsibility where we are. It does not set a good example, especially in a state where it's easier to reduce pollution. If we say we're going to set this one out, and I have to say, my family has been in Vermont 9 generations. I'm really proud of Vermont's history, and when I was raised and growing up, learning about Vermont's history, I always got the feeling that when we were at our best, we did not shirk responsibility. We took responsibility. We didn't say we're going to sit this out. We said, we're going to lead and make a difference both for Vermonters and hope that our example matters elsewhere as well. We did that making outsized contributions in other generational challenges like the Civil War. And we did it when it came to marriage equality not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. We didn't say, well, Vermont shouldn't guarantee equal rights to gay and lesbian folks because there's only a small number of them in Vermont relative to their population globally. We said, no, we should do right by them here and set an example that hopefully resonates farther. And so I just think that it's, I don't get the morality or the ethics of saying we shouldn't take responsibility, we should shirk it, especially when there's so much opportunity in the transition. And that's what I want to talk about, because I think that there is this myth that the status quo is affordable, that continuing to rely on fossil fuels is going to somehow bring down energy costs. And we know it's not true because it's such an outdated and inefficient technology. Let's just bring this down to the household level. A very specific example, using some of the latest data from our annual progress report. If your water heater dies and you've got a choice of installing a new propane water heater or installing a heat pump water heater, it is true that without incentives, and there are incentives to bring down the cost of a heat pump water heater, but without incentives, on average, you might pay $4,000 for a heat pump water heater versus maybe $3,000 for a propane water heater. And so I think a lot of people, when they talk about affordability, they're just talking about the equipment cost. And it makes sense that a propane water heater is less expensive than a heat pump water heater because it is a worse piece of technology. What do I mean by that? Let's expand the view from the upfront cost to the overtime cost. If you're using a heat pump water heater to heat your water for the next 12 years, the average total cost of that, plus the equipment, is going to be about $6,500. If instead you buy that cheaper propane water heater, your total cost over 12 years is going to be $9,500 on average. So choosing the less efficient piece of technology is going to lead to $3,000 more in total costs, fuel and equipment, over the next 12 years. That is what is not affordable. The fossil fuel industry locks people in by selling really cheap, inefficient equipment and then making a lot of money by you having to buy a lot of very expensive fuel. More efficient, better technology like heat pump water heaters, like heat pumps, like electric vehicles may cost a little bit more upfront without incentives, and it's often costs less once we get those incentives, which are at significant risk at the federal level now, and money is running out at the state level. So we are going to face headwinds there, but a heat pump is 3 times as efficient as combustion technology because you're transferring heat rather than generating it. And so you only need 1/3 to 1/4 of the energy input to get the same heat or to get the same movement in an electric vehicle. So we're talking about differences in efficiency of the technology that if we don't take advantage of, we're locking in high costs and unaffordable energy for decades when we don't have to do that. And that's what's, I think, missing from this affordability conversation. Look, I grew up in a low-income family. I grew up in an unweatherized apartment above a garage, and we had a propane space heater. And that propane was so expensive that we would not run it overnight, sleep under multiple blankets, wake up, eat our cereal in front of that propane heater set to its lowest setting. And it was so unaffordable. I mean, it was so unaffordable that, there were times when the pipes froze because we couldn't keep the place warm enough because propane was that expensive. And you look over time at these heating fuel options, and propane and fuel oil and kerosene are the most expensive options out there. And so I agree with Vermonters. I'm really sympathetic with people who say what we're doing is unaffordable. Absolutely. It's the fossil fueled status quo that's unaffordable. And so what we need to do is figure out how to get people off of those high costs, off of that fossil fueled roller coaster, onto more efficient and lower cost options that are going to save us all money over time, in addition to helping reduce pollution and doing our part to reduce climate pollution.
Yeah, it's interesting because I always thought, thinking back, 20 or 30 years, ever since the whole climate change conversation began in earnest, that when it became cheaper to use renewable sources of energy as opposed to legacy fossil fuels, that's when the turning point would come. And really until about, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, I guess, roughly speaking, the cost of fossil fuels was much lower than renewables were, it seems like. But that cost differential is now narrowed so much. In fact, I mean, renewable energy from solar and wind is cheaper than a lot of fossil fuels, but it's still such a struggle, it seems like, to kind of get people over that hump, or businesses over that hump. But I guess, do you have any thoughts on how that mind shift can finally happen? Because when the numbers are showing that it is cheaper to go this route rather than the traditional one, people are still really struggling with that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that many of these technologies are still relatively new for a lot of Vermonters. And so there's questions, there's uncertainty. And I think what that means is those of us who have experienced the cost saving benefits and the quality of life improvements by moving away from fossil fuel need to be open to sharing those examples and listening to the concerns of people who haven't, so we can talk about what it's like, and how much money we're saving. You know, the average EV driver in Vermont is saving $1,000 a year on fuel costs compared to somebody who's driving a gas vehicle. But you know, a lot of this technology is still relatively new. We've only got 12,000 EVs in Vermont, about 60,000 cold climate heat pumps, and about 20,000 heat pump water heaters. So, you know, often it's still a handful of early adopters in our communities who are doing this. And I think it's funny, I almost think that there is like, I think a lot of the early adopters are doing it because we feel a responsibility to help reduce pollution and get off of fossil fuels. And so, because people know that that is an impulse for a lot of people, I think that they're skeptical that there's also these cost savings, which are also very real. You know, there's also just quality of life benefits to a lot of these things. You know, like my wife and I have been in our home now for 10 years. When we moved in, it's like a lot of Vermont homes. It was built in 1880, 1890. And when we moved in, it was incredibly leaky and inefficient. It had a fuel oil furnace. And that first winter we were in the place, just to keep it at like 62 degrees, we had to use over 1,000 gallons of fuel oil. But we were never comfortable. And I think we paid, you know, over $3,000 in fuel oil that first winter. And we just said, this is not sustainable. And so the first thing we did the next spring was work with a weatherization provider. We did a whole home weatherization. We had to take out a loan. We were making the median household income in Vermont at the time as a state employee. But we did that, and it cut our heat loss in half, and it made it so that we were then able to heat the whole house with a wood pellet stove and get off of that fuel oil. And we switched to a heat pump water heater as well. And so what we've seen over the last decade is that our annual heating costs are more than half of what they were before, and our home is more comfortable. And that's what I want more Vermonters to be able to take advantage of, is the health benefits, the money saving benefits, the air quality benefits of moving away from these heavily polluting, high-cost fossil fuels.
One question that also seems to come up fairly often when we're talking about making this transition is be much greater reliance on electricity for many of these heat sources, like electric vehicles, for instance. And then the question then becomes, do we have a robust enough electric grid to be able to handle it? We'll be putting a lot more pressure on it, particularly if heat pumps become more widely adopted. Is that a concern you think that's justified, that we have an electric grid here in the state that's not up to snuff?
I think it's a really fair question, and I think that it's worth asking the folks who manage that grid every day the question. And when Velco has looked at this, they do a long-range transmission plan so that they're planning ahead for our electric demand and what is the capacity at the transmission and distribution level to handle that. And I think that there's some good news that often goes unnoticed, and that is because Vermont was a national leader in creating the first in the nation energy efficiency utility. We've been making investments since 2000 in reducing electricity use and investing in energy efficiency. And what that has meant is that our peak loads have gone down over time, and that's created headroom where our existing transmission and distribution system has more capacity than it did have in the past, which creates room for this beneficial electrification for folks to charge EVs and use heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. And in the near term, Velco has made clear that they are confident in our ability to meet those growing loads out to 2030 and beyond. The farther you get away from 2030, the more that there will need to be some appropriate upgrades at the distribution level. But a lot of this can be managed well by technology that allows for managed charging and avoiding those peak periods of demand when things are most costly. So I'll give an example of that. A number of our utilities, especially Green Mountain Power, offer off-peak charging rates. So if you have an electric vehicle, they will give you a lower rate if you allow them to have access to your charger so that they can make sure your vehicle's only not charging at the periods of peak demand. And that helps everybody because our rates are set by those periods of peak demand. And so the more that we can lower our peak electricity demand, the more that we are avoiding peaker plants in the New England region, which are heavily polluting, and the more that we can keep electricity costs low and smooth out those curves of electricity demand and more fully utilize the system that we have.
So if I were to charge my electric vehicle at midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning, that's a better way to go than if I try to run it from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. or something like that. Is that basically the idea?
Well, it's for me, it's like I will get home, I'll plug in my EV, and Green Mountain Power charges it when it's not a peak event. And I may not know if it wasn't charging for an hour period in which there was a peak event, but when I wake up in the morning, it's 100%. I don't care if it's charging between 8 and midnight versus 6 and midnight, as long as when I get up, it's going to be fully charged. So that those managed charging programs I think are really good for avoiding unnecessary increases in load and keeping costs low for ratepayers, and they're beneficial for me as an individual ratepayer, getting a lower cost of electricity on that managed EV rate.
Before we have to run, I did want to ask you just sort of something to follow up on a point you made. At the federal level, we have a new administration taking office in a few weeks that, at least out in the campaign trail, was somewhat less robust in its support for renewable energy than one might have heard from the other side. Do you think there's a real potential that if the federal government slows down on its support for renewable energy and climate emissions and looks to drill baby drill or whatever, that we're going to end, perhaps pulls the United States out of the Paris Climate Accords like it did the first time around? How serious a setback would that be?
I mean, I think one of the biggest risks at the federal level is what would happen with the incentives that were created with the Inflation Reduction Act. Those were long-term investments that were really designed to help bring down the upfront cost of these more efficient technologies to help people cut pollution and cut costs over time. And so without those, it will make things more challenging. So if anybody is thinking about doing some of these projects, getting an EV, heat pump water heater, heat pump, now is the time. I would not delay to make sure that you can have full access to the available incentives at the federal and state level. That said, I do think that there's a lot of both room for and responsibility for states to step up in the absence of federal leadership. And I think that at the end of the day, the advantage that the clean energy transition has is that people want lower costs, they want more efficient and responsible energy use, and the days of burning fossils inefficiently, creating pollution, and relying on these global commodity fuels that, we saw fuel oil spike in price by over $2 a gallon after Russia invaded Ukraine, and we couldn't do anything about it. It literally requires a third to a quarter of the energy to heat water, to heat a home, to move a vehicle when you're using electric technology as it does using outdated combustion technology. And so that efficiency is what enables lower costs. And I think in the end, what I'm hearing that Vermonters want is more affordable energy and lower costs. And it's incredibly obvious, just given the technology, given the numbers, that our fossil fuel system is not affordable and will not deliver the cost savings and the efficiency that we can get from electric vehicles, from heat pumps, from heat pump water heaters. And that's the win-win that I'm interested in, as somebody who grew up in a lower income family, as somebody who thinks that Vermont should take responsibility rather than shirk responsibility. Let's look for those win-win solutions where we can cut pollution and cut costs with better technology and getting away from fossil fuels.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there for today, Jared. Once again, always fascinating to hear your insights into this. And again, I'll just put in a plug for folks to pick up a copy of this report here that the Energy Action Network put out. If you really want to drill down and get into the world of deep nerdism on this stuff, this is the place to go.
And if I may have one last word, Andrew.
Absolutely.
I understand that I am humbled by this honor. I understand, I hope I'm not breaking news here, that I am the last interview that you are conducting as news director at GNAT-TV, and I am sure that I speak for many guests and many viewers that I have so appreciated and admired your work, the curiosity that you bring to the topics of the day, the thoughtful, civil way that you host and engage in conversations, and your dedication to getting these stories, getting this information right, to communicating well and thoughtfully with Vermonters. And so I just want to tip my hat to you for all of the great work that you have done. I have enjoyed every conversation I've ever had with you, and I think that I know that I am better for your work, and I know that a lot of viewers feel more informed and grateful for the contributions you've made as well. So cheers to you, my friend.
Well, Jared, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's very kind of you to say. Yeah, this probably will be the last sort of in-depth interview I'll be doing as the news director. I may not be disappearing entirely. I'm not heading for the rocking chair just yet, so I'll be seeing you around.
Good. Count on it.
All right. And thanks to all of you who have been with us today, and I hope you found our program interesting. And, well, Happy New Year. We'll see you again in 2025.